A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesius, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 0401, Macedonia, Serpent Strike Prelude. The late autumn rain of 369 BCE over the plains of Larissa did not wash away the blood. It only turned the dark volcanic soil of Thessaly into a slick crimson mire. A biting pre-winter wind howled down from the peaks of Mount Asa, carrying the smell of wet wool, charred timber, and the copper stench of a freshly slaughtered battlefield. The sky hung low, a bruised expanse of charcoal clouds that bloated the afternoon into a premature, freezing twilight. King Alexander II of Macedon stood atop the captured ramparts of the citadel, his royal purple chlamys splattered with the black mud of the southern campaign and stiffening with frost at the hem. Beneath the fortress walls, the vast Thessalian marshlands exhaled a thick, rising fog that swallowed the silhouettes of dead horses and broken chariots scattered across the valley. He was so young to bear the weight of a fracturing empire. Barely a year ago, Alexander had inherited a poisoned crown from his father, the weary King Amyntas III. For nearly 3 decades, Amyntas had survived by the skin of his teeth, playing foreign empires against each other, while the kingdom's finances ran to absolute zero. As the firstborn, Alexander had inherited nothing but massive crown debts, a depleted treasury, and a capital city, Pella, that felt less like a seat of government and more like a gilded snake pit. Pella was a lowland fortress choking on its own luxury, its inner court split into 100 bleeding factions. There, the ancient lowland nobility constantly rubbed shoulders with the fiercely independent clans of the upper cantons, and every corridor whispered with the threat of a coup. Deep within the shifting shadows of that palace, the heart of the Argead house was fracturing. Queen Mother Eurydice moved through the silent chambers like a ghost clad in mourning black. The grief of losing her husband, Amyntas, still hung heavy and suffocating over her shoulders. She had spent a lifetime standing beside a king who fought off assassins, only to be left a widow in a court that grew more predatory by the hour. Her sleepless eyes were permanently fixed on her 2 younger sons, the remaining anchors of her soul. Perdiccas, just 16, was still so painfully young, a boy thrust into a world of monsters before his muscles had even hardened for real armor. He did not know how to rule, nor did he understand the complex financial traps being laid across the kingdom. But the sheer terror of their isolation was forcing him to grow up too fast. He spent his days frozen behind the palace pillars, his wide, sharp eyes intensely tracking the movements of the palace guard, trying to discern which spears belonged to his brother, and which had been bought by up-country gold. His hands tightened around a blunt wooden training blade, not out of tactical ambition, but out of a raw, defensive instinct to shield his family. Beside him was the youngest, the boy Philip, barely 13, yet possessing an unnerving, silent intelligence that absorbed every tense argument, every hushed betrayal whispered between the pillars of Pella. Eurydice held them close to her skirts, knowing that if her eldest son fell in the south, her unready younger boys would be entirely at the mercy of the vultures. The absolute epicenter of that palace rot was Ptolemy of Aluros. That was the bitterest pill for Alexander to swallow. Ptolemy was not a distant rebel, but the most trusted statesman his father had left behind. Under King Amyntas III, Ptolemy had been the chief diplomatic architect of the realm, chosen to travel to Athens to negotiate the very treaties that kept the dynasty alive. He was woven directly into the immediate fabric of the royal household, having married Alexander's own sister, Euryno, sent to his bed as a desperate political gamble to stabilize the power balance within the court. But when the old king died, the trusted diplomat became a cold, calculating roadblock to the young heir's sovereignty. Ptolemy wielded immense leverage. He held deep ties to the fiercely independent upcountry nobility, and he knew exactly how hollow the royal treasury truly was. With Macedonia buried under crushing crown debts and unable to regularly pay its own standing forces, Ptolemy used his vast financial networks to quietly buy the loyalty of the Pella court, hollowing out Alexander's executive authority from within. From his sharp eye, the new king seemed to have set Pella and Macedonia into a self-destructive survival mode. The atmosphere inside the palace was suffocating, thick with the scent of pine smoke and the unuttered threat of open civil war. Factions were drawing their lines in the dirt. On one side stood the old guard of the military aristocracy, anchored by the elder Attalus, a stubborn, iron-willed veteran of Amyntas's wars, who watched the young king's southern adventurism with open contempt, quietly aligning his heavy lowland infantry interests with Ptolemy's financial backers. Beside him, his nephew, the fiery young Attalus, was already rallying the younger noble bloodlines, treating Ptolemy not as a usurper, but as a stabilizing force who could rescue the kingdom from a reckless teenage monarch. Against this gathering storm, the young king's inner circle was desperately trying to hold the front line. A young Antipater, functioning as the sharpest administrative mind in the palace, was drowning in the bankrupt state ledgers, frantically trying to locate loose coin to pay the palace guard before Ptolemy's gold could corrupt them entirely. Out on the training fields, a young, brilliant General Parmenion was fighting a losing battle to maintain the discipline of the Pizzetoroi infantry and the elite companion cavalry. Parmenion knew his men were freezing, hungry, and entirely vulnerable to the upcountry bribes being funneled through the Lyncestian and Elymite barons. Young King Alexander knew he was ruling on borrowed time. The domestic factions backing his brother-in-law were positioning Ptolemy to seize absolute control of the regency to be above him. It was this exact, suffocating political encirclement that had driven Alexander south into Thessaly. He desperately needed a massive, lightning-fast military triumph and the heavy plunder that came with it to solvent the crown's finances, secure the fierce loyalty of the Pizzetoroi infantry, and give him the raw leverage needed to march back into Pella, reward Parmenion's loyal spears, and permanently eliminate his father's old favorite before the court tore itself apart. Beside him now on the ramparts, shielding themselves from the freezing downpour beneath a hasty canopy of waterlogged leather, the generals of the Thessalian League raised their heavy silver wine cups in fierce, raucous toasts. Steam rose from their breath and the hot, spiced wine as they cheered. They had done the impossible. Together, the Macedonian heavy lances, their ashwood shafts splintered but victorious, and the League's elite cavalry had shattered the mercenary lines of the tyrant Alexander of Pheræ. The tyrant had fled like a beaten dog back to his coastal stronghold, leaving his grand garrisons at Larissa and Cranon to be occupied by Macedonian iron. But as the young Argead king looked out over the conquered valley, watching the rain hiss against the campfires of his freezing men below, his fingers tightened around the freezing pommel of his sword. The cold of the iron seeped through his leather gloves. This victory was a poisoned chalice. By crossing the mountains in the dying days of the campaign season and placing permanent Macedonian garrisons so deep into the south, he had broken the unspoken geopolitical boundary. He had directly defied the iron will of Thebes, and as the winter ice began to lock the mountain passes behind him, he was entirely exposed. The response from the southern superpower had been swift and terrifying. Down in Boeotia, the southern titan had mobilized. General Pelopidas, furious at the Macedonian overreach, was already marching a veteran expeditionary column northward. The news of the Theban advance rippled through the cantons like a tremor before an earthquake. Northern Greece was buckling under a sudden suffocating tension. The dominoes were falling, and every predator in the region smelled the vulnerability of a young king who had reached too far. Macedonia was no longer a kingdom. It was an anvil, and 4 massive hammers were descending simultaneously from the cardinal points of the horizon. In the center sat Pella, a capital choking on its own luxury, utterly blind to the reality that its young king, Alexander II, had just marched his crown into a perfect, inescapable encirclement. High in the western passes, where the cold winds bit through leather armor, King Bartolus of Illyria watched the lowland fires. He had spent his youth as a charcoal burner, but now he ruled a united barbarian juggernaut. From his mountain ridges, he could see that the Macedonian field army was completely divided, stuck in Thessalian garrisons, or scrambling back toward Pella. He didn't just command men, he commanded an engine, thousands of bronze-clad tribal veterans locked into rigid interlocking infantry squares that ground forward with the slow, unstoppable physics of a landslide. They held the high passes of Lyncestis by the throat, their iron-tipped spears pointed directly at the fertile underbelly of the Argead plains. Bartolus ordered his tribal chieftains to halt the trade caravans and light the signal fires, preparing to rip the western frontier wide open. To the north and east, the horizon burned with a different kind of threat. Pausanias the Pretender, the exiled Argead prince, bared his teeth in a hidden camp on the borders of Chalcidice. He had turned the wilderness of Thrace into a roaring forge of treason. He did not possess the ancestral loyalty of the people, but his tables groaned under the weight of deep, bottomless chestfuls of barbarian gold. His mercenary armies were a tapestry of bloodletters, hill tribesmen, and rogue hoplites who fought for the next silver coin. His spies had just returned from Pella with word of the court's panic. Pausanias drew his blade, his mercenary captains eager for blood. The silver was paid. The contracts were signed. They stood at the gates of Mygdonia, waiting only for the central palace guard to drop before launching a lightning blitzkrieg toward the throne itself. Right between these outer borders and the bleeding heart of Pella, the rot had infected the mountains themselves. The Upper Canton nobility, the fiercely independent dynasties of the Lyncestians and Elymiots, moved like shadows through the high valleys. They detested the centralizing tyranny of the lowland kings and viewed Alexander II's southern adventurism as an existential liability that would invite southern armies into their backyards. They weren't waiting to be conquered. In the high estates surrounding the capital, their proud, heavily armored cavalry barons met in tight, armed circles, quietly assuring Ptolemy of their retainers, their horses, and their silence. They were the enemy inside the fortress lines, controlling the critical mountain passes, ready to lock the young king's vanguard out and open the gates to the highest bidder. From the south, the earth trembled under a civilized, terrifyingly disciplined cadence. Pelopidas of Thebes was marching. The southern titan did not move with the chaotic fury of a barbarian or the desperate greed of a pretender. He moved with the heavy, calculated majesty of an empire. Behind him trailed the deep, unyielding columns of the Boeotian phalanx, the men who had broken Sparta at Leuctra. They were marching north not to conquer, but to punish, their long lances forming a forest of iron designed to put the young Argead king back in his place and secure the northern borders under the absolute hegemony of Thebes. And in the southeast, bleeding but far from broken, Alexander of Pherae nursed his hatred in the shadows of his coastal fortress. The Thessalian tyrant had lost the field at Larissa, but a man who rules by poison does not need a battlefield to win a war. He was a master of unconventional warfare who had secured his own crown by eliminating his brother Polyphron. As his scouts tracked Pelopidas's march, the tyrant began sending covert bags of coin to the mercenaries trailing the Theban baggage train. He didn't need to fight the Macedonian king on the battlefield anymore. He just needed to create enough chaos in Pella to force the Macedonian garrisons to abandon Larissa and withdraw. He would win his war with whispers and gold, not shields. He was the invisible anchor of the vice, calculating the exact moment to strike the Macedonian rear. In the shadows of the royal court at Pella, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and raw terror. Ptolemy of Aluros paced the length of his private chambers, his skin pale beneath his trimmed beard. He was an upcountry baron who had tried to play the game of courts, but the young king's sudden military alliance with the lowland nobility had backed him into a lethal corner. Rumors were already circulating through the palace corridors. Once the Thessalian crisis was settled, the young king Alexander II intended to launch a domestic purge. Ptolemy knew his name was at the top of the executioner's list. If he did not strike the Argead line immediately, he would be a corpse before the winter snows. The stage was set. The festival of the Delesius war dance was approaching. The music would play, the bronze shields would clash, and in the smoke of the palace floor, the daggers were waiting to be drawn. To be continued in the opening of Volume 1, Macedonia. Serpent Strike. Alexine, A Great Argead Saga Volume 1. Telesius, The War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesius Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.